November 23, 1942, Stalingrad, Soviet Union. Snow drifted across the frozen steppe, covering the wreckage of tanks, burned-out trucks, and the bodies of men who had fallen where they stood. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, the wind howled through shattered windows and collapsed factories, carrying the smell of smoke, oil, and death. Deep beneath what was once a tractor factory, General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, studied a flickering map by lantern light. Red pins surrounded the city on all sides. The Soviets had closed the ring. What had been a relentless advance had now become a trap. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, and food was running out. Ammunition was low. The wounded froze in their foxholes, and the horses, once used to pull artillery, were now slaughtered for meat. But despite the grim reality, one command echoed across the radio lines from Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg. The Sixth Army will stand fast. Stalingrad must be held. No step backward. Paulus's staff officers, gaunt and hollow-eyed, stared at one another in disbelief. They knew the army was encircled, cut off from supplies, surrounded by 7 Soviet armies, and trapped more than 200 miles from the nearest German mine. The Soviets had struck with precision under Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that smashed through the weaker Romanian divisions guarding the flanks. Now, more than 300,000 men, Germans, Romanians, and Italians, were trapped inside a freezing cauldron of destruction. Paulus reached for his field telephone, his hand trembling slightly from cold and exhaustion. "We must attempt to break out," he said quietly to his operations chief, "before it's too late." But the order never came. Hitler had already spoken, and his word was law. In his headquarters, deep in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler paced before a giant map of the Eastern Front. His generals, Keitel, Jodl, and Zeitzler, stood silently as he ranted about willpower, destiny, and German strength. "Retreat," he spat. "Do you know what that means? It means admitting weakness. It means surrendering everything we've fought for." He jabbed a finger at Stalingrad, the city on the Volga that bore Stalin's name. To him, it was not just a battlefield, it was a symbol, a personal duel between dictators. To abandon Stalingrad is to admit that Stalin is stronger, and I will never do that. The room fell silent. Even the senior officers, men hardened by years of war, dared not argue further. Hitler's fury was absolute, his conviction unshakable. In his mind, Germany's fate was bound to that single city. He sent a message to Paulus. "The Sixth Army will hold its ground. Supplies will be delivered by air. Relief is on the way." It was a death sentence disguised as reassurance. Back in Stalingrad, the first signs of collapse were already visible. Soldiers wrapped their boots in rags to keep their feet from freezing. Canned food had run out. Now they boiled wallpaper paste for its glue and melted snow for water. Still, they held the ruins of the city like ghosts haunting their own graves. The Soviets attacked day and night with artillery, turning buildings into dust. Entire divisions vanished beneath the rubble. Then came the Luftwaffe's promise, the airlift. Hermann Göring, head of the German Air Force, had boasted to Hitler that his planes could supply the Sixth Army by air, 500 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition per day. In reality, even under perfect weather, the Luftwaffe managed barely 90 tons. Many aircraft were shot down by Soviet fighters or crashed on icy runways. Those that landed brought little: crates of bread, bandages, and sometimes, absurdly, champagne meant for officers' mess halls. In the bunkers below the city, the men began to whisper that they had been abandoned. "The Führer will not forget us," Paulus assured them, but even he no longer believed it. Every day more soldiers froze to death. Every night, Soviet loudspeakers blared across the front lines, calling out in German, "Sixth Army soldiers, you are surrounded. The end is near. Surrender and live." Some did, most did not, because Hitler's words still hung over them like chains. Surrender is treason. In Berlin, reports of the encirclement were softened, censored, and wrapped in false optimism. Propaganda films showed maps of the heroic defense of Stalingrad, while radio broadcasts promised that German resolve will triumph. But inside the Führer's headquarters, the truth was harder to ignore. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group Dawn, proposed a plan, Operation Winterstorm, a relief offensive to break through to Paulus's trapped army. Hitler agreed reluctantly, but only on one condition: the Sixth Army must not attempt to break out. They were to hold the city until Manstein reached them. By the time the relief force began its attack in mid-December, the situation inside Stalingrad had already deteriorated beyond hope. Fuel reserves were gone, tanks were frozen in place, ammunition was rationed to 5 rounds per day. The wounded lay in unheated cellars, their breath forming clouds in the icy air. Paulus received word that Manstein's spearhead had reached within 30 miles of the city. His officers begged him to move, to fight their way out while they still could. But Hitler's message arrived again, cold, final, absolute. The Sixth Army will hold its positions. Stalingrad must not be abandoned. Paulus obeyed. The last chance of escape slipped away like smoke in the snow. In the Soviet lines, General Zhukov watched as German resistance began to collapse. His men tightened the ring daily, cutting off the last airfields and supply points. By Christmas, the Sixth Army was starving. Soldiers roasted rats and dug through snow for frozen potatoes. Entire companies were reduced to a handful of survivors. Still, Hitler's radio messages continued. "Hold firm. The honor of Germany depends on you." By now, those words sounded like mockery. In January 1943, the Soviets launched their final assault. The city that Hitler refused to surrender became a graveyard of his own making. German soldiers fought with bayonets, knives, and bare hands amid the ruins. Paulus, surrounded in the basement of the Univergum department store, received one last order from Hitler. "You are promoted to field marshal. No German field marshal has ever surrendered." It was an unmistakable message. Kill yourself before surrendering. Paulus refused. On February 2nd, 1943, he surrendered the remnants of his army, 91,000 survivors out of more than 300,000 who had entered the city. As Soviet soldiers led the emaciated prisoners away through the ruins, Paulus stood silently at the window, staring at the white wasteland that had once been Stalingrad. The city had become Hitler's obsession and Germany's undoing. What began as a symbol of strength ended as a monument to madness. January 1943. Rastenburg, East Prussia. The wolf's lair was silent beneath the snow. In the dimly lit conference room, the map of Stalingrad hung on the wall like a wound that refused to heal. Red arrows surrounded the city, pointing inward, the symbol of encirclement. Hitler sat at the long wooden table, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly from medication and rage. For days he had refused to believe that the Sixth Army could fall. His aides whispered that the Führer no longer slept, pacing through the night, muttering to himself about betrayal and weakness. "If only Paulus had shown more faith," Hitler snapped to Keitel, pounding his fist against the map. "If only he had stood firm, the situation could have been reversed." In truth, There was no situation to reverse. The Sixth Army was finished, frozen, starved, annihilated. But Hitler clung to illusion as if it were oxygen. For him, Stalingrad was not about strategy anymore. It was about destiny. He had promised Germany victory on the Eastern Front. He had told his people that the Red Army was broken, that Soviet cities would fall like dominoes. But now that narrative, that myth, was dying in the snow along the Volga, and Hitler could not allow it to die without dragging hundreds of thousands of men with it. To understand why Hitler refused to evacuate Stalingrad, one must look deeper into the furnace of his ideology and his obsession with power. From the very beginning, Hitler viewed warfare not as a science, but as a test of will. He admired the fanatic, the man who fought to the death rather than retreat. To him, defeat was not a military outcome, it was a moral failure. When his generals pleaded for a breakout, when they presented rational arguments, logistics, and facts, he saw only cowardice. You think like accountants, he told them. You calculate losses, supplies, distances. But war is not about numbers. It's about faith. That belief blinded him. Stalingrad became his personal duel with Joseph Stalin. Two dictators locked in a symbolic struggle for supremacy. The city's name alone taunted him, daring him to conquer it. To withdraw would mean letting Stalin claim victory, and for Hitler, humiliation was worse than destruction. Back at the front, soldiers began carving messages into frozen walls. "We are the forgotten army. Where is the Luftwaffe? God forgive Germany." In the Führer's headquarters, none of that mattered. Hitler's reality was shaped not by reports, but by his fantasies of heroism, endurance, and divine destiny. When Field Marshal Erich von Manstein arrived to brief him after the failure of Operation Winter Storm, Hitler listened in silence, then suddenly interrupted with fury. "You're telling me we cannot save them because the weather is bad? Because the Soviets are strong? Do you know what I hear? Excuses, always excuses." Manstein tried to reason with him. "Mein Führer, Stalingrad is lost. If we do not withdraw now, we will lose the entire army." Hitler leaned forward, his voice trembling. "Then they will die there, but they will die as heroes." The words hung in the air, cold, final, delusional. In reality, Hitler's insistence on holding Stalingrad was not born only of pride. It was also fear. Fear of appearing weak. Fear of losing his mystique of invincibility. Since the lightning victories of 1940 and 1941, Hitler's authority had rested on one illusion: that his instincts were infallible, that he could see what his generals could not. And for a time, it worked. France fell in 6 weeks. The Balkans were crushed. The Soviet Union reeled under blitzkrieg, but by late 1942, the illusion began to crumble. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, stretched across thousands of miles. Supplies were dwindling, casualties were mounting, and for the first time, the enemy was adapting. If Hitler admitted that Stalingrad was a mistake, it would shatter his aura. The man who had defied logic and won before would be exposed as mortal. So he doubled down. He convinced himself that holding Stalingrad would break the Soviet will, that reinforcements from the Caucasus would arrive, that the Luftwaffe would perform miracles. Reality was irrelevant. Only belief mattered. As January turned to February, the last radio signals from Stalingrad grew desperate. Out of ammunition, men eating horses, frostbite cases in the thousands, no food for 5 days, many dying, still holding positions. One transmission came from Paulus himself. "Request permission to surrender to save the remaining wounded." The reply came swiftly from Rastenburg, dictated by Hitler himself. "Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will fight to the last man." By then, there was almost no one left to fight. When news finally arrived that Paulus had surrendered, Hitler locked himself in his study. Witnesses said they heard him shouting, throwing furniture, cursing the generals, the weather, even fate itself. "They should have fought to the last bullet," he screamed. "They should have shot themselves rather than fall into Soviet hands." For days he refused to meet anyone. The defeat at Stalingrad shattered his composure, but not his delusion. Instead of learning from it, he retreated deeper into fantasy, blaming everyone except himself. To the German people, propaganda framed the loss as a heroic sacrifice. Goebbels announced that the fallen had secured the future of Europe. But in truth, the disaster at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end. The myth of Nazi invincibility was gone. The Red Army had proven that Hitler's will could be broken, and that faith alone could not feed starving soldiers or warm, frozen corpses. As the snow melted over the ruins of Stalingrad, the Soviets buried their dead. The city that had once been Hitler's obsession was now reduced to rubble, yet it stood defiant. The German dead remained where they had fallen, scattered across a white wasteland that stretched to the Volga. And somewhere in East Prussia, Hitler continued to stare at his maps, muttering to himself, still convinced that destiny was on his side. He had not yet realized that Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was the moment the war turned against him. February 1943, Berlin, Germany. The news of Stalingrad's surrender reached the German people like a thunderclap. For months, propaganda had promised victory. Now, suddenly, there was only silence. No triumphant marches, no fanfare, only the grim voice of Joseph Goebbels on the radio, his tone somber, deliberate, rehearsed. The heroic Sixth Army has fulfilled its historic mission in accordance with the highest traditions of the German soldier. They fought until the last bullet, but behind the rhetoric, Germany trembled. The myth of invincibility, the faith that had carried the nation through Poland, France, and the Balkans, was shattered. Mothers wept quietly over photographs of sons who would never return. In factories, workers paused at their machines to listen, their faces pale, their hands shaking. For the first time, the German people realized what had happened. They could lose the war. In Rostenburg, Hitler refused to attend public ceremonies. He appeared only briefly, delivering a short, defiant speech. But the fire that once burned in his voice was gone. "We will recover from this," he muttered, staring at the floor. "We will avenge Stalingrad." But even his closest aides noticed the change. The man who once believed himself chosen by fate now moved through his headquarters like a ghost. He ate in silence, refused visitors, and spent long hours studying maps, shifting divisions that no longer existed, issuing orders to units that were already dead. His generals, once merely obedient, now began to despair. General Zeitzler, the army's chief of staff, lost wake rapidly, a silent protest against the starvation at Stalingrad. Each day, he ate only as much as a soldier trapped in the city might have eaten. Hitler barely noticed. "They should have fought harder," he repeated. "They should have believed in me." But belief could not change the cold mathematics of war. To the east, the Soviets celebrated. Marshal Zhukov and General Chuikov stood among the smoking ruins, surveying the destruction. For the first time in the war, the Red Army had annihilated a major German force, not just defeated it, but destroyed it completely. In Moscow, Stalin was jubilant. Posters went up across the city. Stalingrad, the tomb of the fascist invader. The victory transformed Soviet morale. Soldiers who had once fought defensively now marched forward with confidence. The legend of Stalingrad spread like wildfire, proof that Hitler's army could bleed, could starve, could die. From that point onward, the Red Army's advance would never stop. Meanwhile, in the German command structure, cracks deepened. Field Marshal Manstein, one of the few remaining strategic thinkers, tried to rebuild the front. He launched counteroffensives in southern Russia, briefly stabilizing the line, but it was a temporary illusion. Germany no longer had the manpower or fuel to sustain such wars of movement. The losses at Stalingrad, over 300,000 men, 700 tanks, 1,000 aircraft, and the myth of German supremacy were irreplaceable. Behind the front, whispers spread through the officer corps. For the first time, some began to wonder out loud if the Führer had lost his mind. "He believes he can command the weather," one officer wrote in his diary. "He believes victory comes from faith, not fuel." They weren't wrong. Back home, Goebbels faced an impossible task: to transform catastrophe into courage. On February 18, 1943, he stood before a packed audience at the Sportpalast in Berlin and delivered his most infamous speech. "Do you want total war?" The crowd roared in orchestrated unison. Yes, but the energy was hollow, desperate. It was the scream of a nation that sensed the abyss beneath its feet. Goebbels' words were meant to reignite fanaticism, to make the people forget Stalingrad. But even he knew, deep down, that something had changed forever. The war was no longer about conquest. It was now about survival. Meanwhile, in Soviet captivity, Friedrich Paulus, the man who once commanded the proud Sixth Army, sat in a drafty barracks outside Moscow. He refused food for days, sunk in quiet humiliation. When interrogators asked why he had obeyed Hitler's impossible orders, he replied softly, "I was a soldier. I followed orders." But as weeks passed, he began to see the truth that many German officers had ignored, that obedience had become complicity. In 1944, he would publicly denounce Hitler, joining the National Committee for a Free Germany, calling on his countrymen to end the war. The same man who had once been the instrument of Hitler's will now became a voice of its collapse. By the end of 1943, the consequences of Stalingrad had spread far beyond the frozen ruins. In North Africa, the Axis forces were retreating toward Tunisia. In Italy, Mussolini's regime began to crumble. In the Atlantic, Allied bombers rained fire over German cities. And on the Eastern Front, Soviet armies pushed relentlessly westward. Each defeat traced its roots back to Stalingrad, to that moment when Hitler chose pride over reason, obsession over strategy, ego over life. The once unbreakable German war machine was now bleeding out, its aura of dominance gone. In a darkened bunker one night, Hitler spoke to his adjutants as snow fell outside the wolf's lair. His voice was quiet, almost tender. "The world will remember Stalingrad as a symbol of German heroism." Perhaps he was right, but not in the way he imagined. For history would remember Stalingrad not as a triumph of heroism, but as the moment when one man's delusion condemned an entire army to death and began the slow unraveling of his empire. The world had witnessed the limits of willpower, the breaking point of blind obedience, and the collapse of a dream built on lies. And in that moment, beneath the ruins of Stalingrad, the seeds of Hitler's downfall had already taken root.